Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Felipe Ramos. I'm the head of the Center for Economics and International Affairs of the University of Salvador. And on behalf of our university, we have here the honor to introduce Professor Robert Lowry in a debate about the American elections, a very important theme today to be discussed not only by Americans, but by everyone, and for Brazilians, people who are in the same hemisphere, in the zone of influence of the United States. For us, it's a very important theme to be discussed right now. We have a president here in Brazil, President Jair Bolsonaro, who considers himself an ally, a close ally of the US president, even though sometimes I don't think Donald Trump thinks Bolsonaro is an ally of him. But it's a very important theme for us Brazilians, and we are very honored to hear from Professor Lowry today. And for this session, we'll have Professor Moisés Conde from the economics department here at our university as a host and mediator. So once again, we'll welcome everyone who is here attending the session, not only our students from our university, but people from all over Brazil who joined us for this session as well. So welcome everybody, and I hope we'll have a wonderful, insightful discussion today led by Professor Moisés Conde and Professor Robert Lowry. Thank you very much. Give the floor, Moisés.
Thank you so much, Professor Ramos. Dr. Lowry, it's a great pleasure for our entire academic community to have you here. So I'm going to make a brief introduction for you, for our students, and then you're going to have a time to talk about our theme that's very important to us. Dr. Lowry is a professor of political science program of the School of Economics, Political and Policy Science at the University of Texas at Dallas. This is also associate program head of director of graduate students in the political science program. He teaches course of American public policy, political parties, and interest groups, politics and business, public choice, state and local government, and empirical democratic theory. His primary areas of research and interest are fiscal policy and institutions, political and civil organizations, and political economy and higher education. The floor is yours, so you can start your speech, and then after that, we're going to start with our questions, okay?
Okay, I don't really have a prepared speech, but the election is coming up fast all of a sudden. It seems we've been talking about it forever, and now it's about 8 weeks away. And it's a very important election. You know, Donald Trump has been completely different than any president, not just in my memory, but in American history. He was elected as someone who didn't fit the mold. The people who supported him largely, I think, supported him because they wanted someone who was not a normal politician, and he certainly has done that. He's created all kinds of controversies. From doing things where it's questionable whether the president has authority or not, to some of the policies that he's promoted, and then the ongoing issue of the incredible numbers of things he says that just aren't true, and it becomes very difficult to really understand sort of what you can believe and what you can't. But nonetheless, he could win the election. His election strategy is also different than normal. Usually, sort of traditionally, we think of politicians in America as trying to appeal to the middle of the political spectrum. It's a very strong two-party system. So we basically have one party on sort of the center right and one on the center left, and we usually think of them as competing for the middle. Trump basically doesn't seem very interested in expanding his base. He's mostly interested in getting his base to turn out, because that's always a huge issue. Turnout in the United States, even in presidential elections, is rarely more than about 60%. and also possibly discouraging the other side from turning out, or something like that. On the other side, you have Joe Biden, who was vice president under Obama for 8 years, who emerged from a big field of Democrats. He's he's kind of a centrist. He's obviously trying to appeal to a very broad coalition of voters. He's 70 years old, and Trump has been making something out of that. Although Trump is 74, so we have a couple of sort of older candidates running. And right now, Biden got about an 8 or 9% lead in the polls. Although, as was driven home in 2016, national polls really don't mean that much. The United States is, I believe, the last country on earth that still uses an electoral college to choose its president. And so what we have is actually 51 separate elections, 50 states plus Washington, D.C. And, in 2016, it really sort of came down to Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, which all went for Trump by very thin margins. But it was enough to swing the election. And so, once again, we have a handful of so-called swing states that are probably going to determine the outcome. There's a couple of other quick comments, and then I'll answer questions. One thing that has become increasingly common in the U.S. is early voting. So even though the election is November 3rd, a couple of states, I think, are starting early voting this week already. Maybe not quite this soon, but pretty soon. But basically, they expect more than half of the votes to be cast before Election Day. And then the thing is, at the opposite end, we're expecting a lot of votes to be cast by mail, many more than normal because of the pandemic. Although there again, the rules vary from state to state. In Texas, you're not allowed to vote by mail simply because you don't want to go out and expose yourself to the pandemic. They have expanded the reasons for voting by mail at all. Other states are allowing anyone who wants to vote by mail to vote by mail. What that means, though, is there will be a lot of votes that won't be counted yet on election. And if the race is very lopsided, then it may just be a matter of counting those votes and making it official. If the race is at all close, we may not know who won for a week or two. And in the meantime, there will be lots of claims, arguments about possible voter fraud and all of this sort of thing. So this could be a very I want to say interesting, but since I'm in the middle of it, I don't think that's an adequate term. A very tense, stressful election before we know who won. And given the differences between the candidates, I think it's going to make a huge difference who wins. And then, of course, we have congressional elections where the Democrats will probably maintain the House. I think it would be a huge upset if they didn't. The Senate is kind of more of a toss-up, although more likely than not, the Republicans will retain control of the Senate. So that's kind of looks right now. I guess, if we'll have comments or questions, I think I'd want to spend most of my time answering them.
Okay, that's great. So we're going to start with the questions. I'm going to start off my own. The first questions. My first question, I think you already answered, is the chance that Trump won the election. But I have a second question concerned about the profile of the Democratic candidate. So we have a very progressive candidate. Even Biden and Kamala Harris is a very progressive, is a very modern candidate. Do you think this profile can reach the average American, the average Joe American? So the average Joe can vote for candidates with this profile?
Well, I wouldn't call Biden terribly progressive. Harris did. Biden got the nomination, I think, partly because he was more moderate than a lot of the other candidates in primaries. Now, he certainly, compared to Trump, he's progressive. No, I don't know if he's all that far from the median voter in the United States. He has a history on certain issues. Crime, for example, he supported a very strong anti-crime bill in the 1990s that at the time was very popular. Bill Clinton was president and was very popular, but now he's getting criticized for it because the opinion has sort of swung the other direction. He doesn't, he doesn't really support. I mean, another issue that has come up is defunding the police. He doesn't really support that. He's in favor of reform, and investigations of police shootings and that sort of thing. Another issue is healthcare. I mean, he doesn't support a single payer healthcare system. He supports expanding insurance under Obamacare. So I think, Biden is probably close enough to the middle. And remember, he was vice president for 8 years, that he can probably get elected. Again, Harris is more progressive, but it's really the president's views that are gonna or the presidential candidate's views that are really gonna matter the most. I see a written question. You want me to? Whoops! It just disappeared. Moises, you're there? I can't hear you now.
Oh, okay. You can hear me now.
Okay, now I can. Okay, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna read the question. So it's from Felipe
Okay.
Nathanael. So, what's your opinion on the National Vote Interstate Compact? Does it represent a threat to the American democracy or the future or hope for the increased popular representation?
Okay, so the Interstate Compact is this plan basically to go around the Electoral College. The United States Constitution, some people say, is the most difficult constitution in the world to amend. It needs 2/3 vote in the House and the Senate, and then 3/4 of the states. But the Interstate Compact basically says state legislatures pass a law that directs their electors to vote according to the national popular vote, regardless what the vote was in their own state. And so far, I'm not sure exactly what the number is, but the states that have passed it are getting pretty close to a majority of the Electoral College. And so if enough states adopt it, that they control a majority of the Electoral College, then it will basically become a national popular vote. And the question was, remember the question, is that a threat to democracy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think most people would say no. I mean, the Electoral College, remember, is sort of an anachronism from the 18th century, when the framers of the Constitution didn't believe most people should be allowed to vote for representatives. They didn't think they knew enough. They weren't educated enough, so forth and so on. And now, many people, sort of democracy with popular votes. I think I guess I haven't seen any polls lately, but if you were to take a poll, I would bet that more than half of the American population would prefer to see a popular vote. Under the Electoral College, the states that are advantaged and that would oppose a constitutional amendment are the small states. The states that are disadvantaged are the ones with really big populations. So if you were to just take an opinion poll, basically a popular vote on whether we should have a popular vote, I think it would probably, be supported. And it would change the nature of campaigns, right? I mean, some people say that Hillary Clinton really won in 2016. No, she didn't. Trump really won according to the rules of the election. If the result were to be that it was decided by a national popular vote, they would run their campaigns differently. Instead of focusing all their attention on the swing states, they would focus it on the big population centers, which is why the small states don't like the idea. But I don't think you can say it would undercut democracy. So I guess that's my answer.
Oh, okay, okay. So, can you make the question, Felipe, or can you read it? So we have a second question here for Professor Felipe. What kind of problem, if any, do you foresee when it comes to the mailing votes, both in terms of legitimacy for the election and of technical feasibility?
What kinds of problems with what?
Do you see with the mail votes? So both in terms of yeah,
Both in terms of technical issues and legitimacy?
yes, that's right.
Take the technical issues first. Well, at a very basic level, there's the issue of getting the mail delivered. The Postal Service has been having financial difficulties for many years. Their delivery record is still good compared to most other national postal services, but it's not as good as it used to be in terms of things being delivered on time. And recently, they've cut back on some of their processing equipment, and there's a big controversy about that. The Democrats have accused the Postmaster General of doing it on purpose in order to slow down the mail delivery, and he claims it's part of just making the whole operation more efficient. I mean so that's why I think that if lots of people vote by mail, we're not likely to know the real final count until several days at least after Election Day. I don't know if there's another technical difficulty with it. I don't know if there's any particular problems with counting those ballots or anything. In terms of legitimacy, yeah, I mean, potentially mail-in votes are more subject to fraud than live voting. I mean, start with the fact that you can't sit and watch someone as they fill out their ballot. And so you can't guarantee that, they weren't sitting there and having somebody else tell them who to vote for. Whereas when you go to, vote live, you vote and you go to the station, the voting station, and nobody else is allowed to go there with you. And you're not allowed to bring at least a tablet with you. I mean, I went to vote a couple of years ago and I just had like a pad, like a folder with paper in it. And they thought I had a tablet with me and they told me I couldn't take it in with me. Now, I don't think they check if you have a cell phone, but the idea is you're supposed to vote based on who you want to vote for. Of course, you can make notes in advance, but you're not supposed to have somebody else telling you who to vote for. And you can't really guarantee that with mail. And of course, there's a step beyond that. There's the issue of whether somebody manages to get a bunch of ballots and fill them out for other people and then just forge the signatures or something like that. Those are all possible. Having said that, some state, Oregon, the state of Oregon, had nothing but mail votes for several years now. They don't have live voting in Oregon anymore. Everybody votes by mail. And to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been any major fraud or any major scandals. So, there's no particular reason to believe it will, but I can assure you that there will be accusations. Whoever is behind will accuse, will claim that there is fraud and there is corruption. And to the extent that legitimacy depends on perceptions, it might undercut the legitimacy of the result.
Okay, so we have one of the students want to ask a question. Juan, you can talk if you want.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Good afternoon, professors. My question to you, Professor Robert, is regarding the social media. As you may have seen, Twitter and Facebook are going to do a background check on the truth behind posts and tweets. And the Trump campaign is heavily based on clickbaity propaganda and his distorted vision of reality in America, especially by his supporters. My question is if this bigger check on the background of the truth behind these posts is going to affect the core of the campaign itself. Thank you.
That's a tough question for me. I use social media very little, but I try the best I can. Um, yeah, so Facebook and Twitter are going to essentially censor some of the election messages, which they can do. They're private companies. You know, they can decide what they want to publish, just like a newspaper can decide which op-eds or stories it wants to publish. But because they're so big and so universal, that draws into question whether they are tilting, skewing the results and favoring one candidate or another, depending on who they censor essentially. And I know Trump has sort of made noises about investigating and ultimately antitrust and this sort of thing, none of which is going to happen before the election. I mean, as far as whether they affect Trump's base, again, I don't really know. I'm assuming that the people who support Trump rely on social media a lot. But those aren't the only, outlets where they can get information. I mean, there's obviously Fox News and a variety of other websites. And, I suspect that, once they start to do it, a skillful political communications consultant will figure out ways to say what they want to say without going over the line. It may cut down on some of the more incendiary comments and arguments, but I expect they'll be able to make their basic points and stay within the line, because I know that certainly Facebook, maybe not quite so much Twitter, did this very reluctantly. I mean, they want to provide a platform for, their goal is basically to connect everybody. And so they were actually quite reluctant to take this step. And so I think they'll be careful not to overdo it. So I guess, my answer is I think that Trump will still be able to get his message to his base, maybe not quite as strong as before, but there, again, there's other outlets that he can use for that purpose.
Okay, we have two more questions. But if anybody wants to make questions out loud, just raise the hand here, so I give the voice. Our third question is, what do you think about the current relationship between the United States and Brazil? It's as strong as it appears on the news?
Well, okay, so I'm definitely not an expert on Brazil. I know that the two presidents apparently get along quite well. I don't know beyond that what it amounts to or what it's going to lead to. I mean, President Trump does seem to get along with strong authoritarian leaders for whatever reason, better than he gets along with, less authoritarian leaders. But ultimately, he tends to have his strongest relationships with countries that he thinks can do something for him, meaning his personal reelection prospects. And I'm not sure where Brazil fits into that. And the other thing that's interesting about that is that, let's suppose he gets reelected. Well, he can't run for a third term. So then what becomes his calculus? The ability of another country to help him get reelected becomes irrelevant if he can't run again. So, what basis will he use for determining his alliances then? He does seem to put a great stock, though, in sort of personal relationships. And so I think, the Brazil and the U.S. will probably still have a good relationship as long as he's president. But, how that translates into, say, international agreements or something like that, I really don't know.
Okay. So the next question is, if mail vote represents a considerable slice of votes for Biden and a Biden win, do you think Trump's accusation of voter fraud could pose a threat to the democratic process?
Yeah, it could. If Biden, if the mail vote, the vote by mail, is enough to make the difference. Especially let's say Trump wins the live vote, but Biden gets enough of the mail votes to end up, the winner. Then I guarantee you there'll be all kinds of claims of corruption, and maybe some lawsuits, and that would really create, I think, really would create big problems for legitimacy. Hopefully the live vote and the mail vote will both produce the same winner. But again, that's a state by state thing. So it may be that the live vote and the mail-in vote will agree in most states, but maybe a couple they won't. And then it really comes down to, sort of how big was the margin in the Electoral College, and what happens if those two states flip. It might turn out that it wouldn't make any difference. But if it makes a difference, again, yes, I think there will be a major battle over whether the mail votes are legitimate, whether there is maybe double voting. Trump actually encouraged people, who vote by mail to go to the polls and ask if their vote has been recorded yet, and if it hasn't, to try to vote in person. So whether there's, double voting, whether there's fraudulent voting by mail, whether another possibility with mail votes is sometimes, a whole box of ballots gets misplaced and just doesn't get counted. Whether the misplacement is innocent or intentional, I don't know, but it happens sometimes. And so I guess my short answer is, if the mail-in ballots make the difference in who wins and who loses, then yeah, it's going to be very controversial, and whoever ends up on the losing side may never really accept it.
Okay. Our next question is from Guilherme. Good afternoon, Professor Lowry. First of all, it was a great honor to receive a prestigious intellectual such as yourself, and thank you for your expose. My question is regarding your opinion on candidates such as Joe Biden. Consider his popularity in a country as polarized as the US. At this particular moment, it is safe to assume that in terms of voter range, for lack of better term, is indeed a success based solely on the solid challenge he provides Donald Trump. Would you say, Professor, that this could possibly represent a trend in how presidential campaigns are run in the near future, creating less polarized, more closely disputed election? What lasting effects do you think you remain on the presidential elections? Thank you for your time.
That was kind of a long question. What was the last part of it? Lasting facts?
What lasting effects do you think remain on the presidential elections?
Well, okay, I don't know if I'm answering the question directly or not here. Biden, as I said before, is not an extremist. He's kind of center left. He's left, but he's center left. And he's definitely running. His whole theme of his campaign is he's trying to run to represent the whole country. And he wants, and he says he wants to listen to and work for the people who vote against him as well as the people who vote for him. And so on things like all the protests that have been going on in American cities, he's trying to bridge the gap between the two sides. He's come out very strong against violence in the protests, but he's also, said that these people have legitimate concerns, and I want to try to work, to bring everybody together. And yeah, in this time of polarization, on the one hand, that's a hard thing to do because yeah, the country is very polarized right now, and it's difficult for people to even talk with you sometimes. At the same time, if somebody can try to do that, that's maybe exactly what we need. And the president is the only national figure. Although again, with the Electoral College, he's not really nationally elected, which, getting back to the earlier question about the compact, is one reason why a national vote could be a good thing. And again, it sort of depends on how you conceive of the nation. Is it just 330 million individuals, and we want to try to bring them together, or is it 50 states? And we want someone who can speak to as many different states and as many different communities as possible. But I mean, if Biden wins, then I think it will definitely in the future, candidates will maybe be more likely to run as a unifier than as someone who just completely promotes one side and attacks the other. I hope that answers the question.
Okay. I have one question. Dr. Lowry, I remember the last election for President Trump, the first election of Trump. The next day, we kind of have fun in your office about the results, especially because the polls are completely wrong. Do you think that an event like this might happen in this election? So you can see the last polls are giving a large victory for Biden. So do you think that the next day of this election, we can see a Trump as a president and everybody asking, what happened? What happened with the polls again?
Yeah. It's possible right now Biden's lead in the polls is bigger than Hillary Clinton's was just before Election Day. Of course, we aren't up to Election Day yet, so we'll have to see how that goes. But again, the real problem is national polls, are not what really matters. It's state polls. Having said, I think Clinton was actually expected to win a number of the swing states that she lost in 2016. And sort of the wild card was voter turnout, right? Because polls generally ask people, they try to survey what they call likely voters. And each polling organization has a set of questions that it uses to determine who the likely voters are. And I think they typically sort of guard their questions closely because they each have their own formula. But basically what happened is that they were wrong in their assessment of who the likely voters were. People turned out for Trump that maybe they didn't think would. And I don't know if the turnout for Clinton was suppressed, but that's kind of what happened. And the polls actually weren't off by very much, but they forecasted to be very close, and it turned out it was very close the other way. If the polls stay where they are now, where Biden has like a 9% lead, 9 to 10% in national polls, it would be incredibly surprising if Trump actually won. I think even the national polls would have to be closer than that. But we still got 8 weeks, By the time we get to Election Day, they might be closer. Although that's complicated again by early voting and mail-in ballots. So I would say maybe the really crucial time is about a month from now, sort of early to mid-October. What do the polls say then? And if he's still ahead by 9 or 10% in the middle of October or late October, it would be extremely unlikely that Trump could pull it off. But if Trump can close the gap to say 3 or 4%, then yeah, it could happen again.
Okay. Some news talking about the new swing states. Do you think that is that possible that some states that are traditional Republicans or traditional Democrats can become a swing state? Personally, I think that, for example, a state like Texas, not in a million years we're gonna have a Democratic state like Texas. Do you think that we're gonna start to having some new swing states in this election?
Sure. Off the top of my head, I don't know which ones are likely to be new swing states, but yeah, states can shift. Again, sort of the three that were most crucial in 2016 turned out to be Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Michigan, and I think all three of them are expected to be swing states again. Florida and Wisconsin. Florida's got lots of electoral college votes, and it's a swing state. I don't know off the top of my head, which are likely to be new swing states. But we certainly could have some. Some people think this will be. I've been hearing that for years. I don't know if actually there are some polls that basically say that Biden and Trump are tied, or maybe even Biden's a little ahead in Texas, although the difference is not statistically significant. I don't know how well I believe those polls. I'd be surprised if Biden manages to take Texas. Again, a lot of it comes down to turnout, especially among the Hispanic voters. But they aren't as solidly Democratic as black voters are. So, again, I wish I could tell you off the top of my head which states might become swing states. But it's certainly possible that them will.
Yeah, is exactly Texas. Some polls say they're tied on Texas.
Yeah.
Personally, for me, it's the same thing to say that California will become a Republican one day. It's kind of something that hate me.
Well, yeah. California actually did used to be a mildly Republican state back in like the 1950s. Now California is as Democratic as they come. And so that's why I say, the whole thing about national polls, California, has the biggest population in the country, which means they probably have the most people in any national poll. And if those poll results are being driven by California Democrats, then, what do they tell us about the rest of the country? Not a lot. But yeah, so it's possible, but I think it would be a real upset if Biden were actually to carry Texas.
Okay, so we have anybody wants to make another questions? So you can say in the phone. In the
Here's
mic.
one in Rome.
Yeah, no, that's it. Thank you.
Oh, there, it just disappeared.
Okay. So this question is going to be a very important election, not just for US, but for Brazil as too. So the relationship between Trump and Bolsonaro, sometimes we think that is getting close, but sometimes we think it's getting apart. So what's the outcomes for this election, not just for the United States, but for the rest, in your perspective? What's the results for this election for the relationship for the North US and China and the rest of the world?
Okay, well, I take that on a couple of levels. A lot of part of that involves international trade. right? And Trump is very suspicious of multilateral trade agreements, like sort of bilateral agreements. He also sort of views trade as a zero-sum game, basically. And so he's generally not a fan of international trade, for the most part. Biden, I haven't really read his policies on trade. If he's sort of, consistent with the Democratic mainstream, he'd be much more open to promoting trade, subject to the caveat that, the unions, although the American unions are much weaker than they used to be, but they're still a really important part of the Democratic coalition, and especially sort of the working class Democratic voters, who are the ones that Biden probably has the most natural appeal to, because he grew up sort of blue collar union town, and those were his friends and his family, and so he's gonna look out for them. But still, I think one aspect of it in general is that Biden will be much more likely to promote trade and more likely to enter into sort of multilateral agreements in general. On the other hand, he'll probably be more concerned about things like human rights violations, and anti-democracy than Trump would. So, it's exactly how those are going to balance out. In general, Biden would be more open to engaging with the rest of the world, and less likely to try to see the U.S. as going it alone. And then the final part of that, again, is the personal relationships. Trump puts great stock in personal relationships. Biden, I don't know, again, he was Obama's vice president, so he really didn't run foreign policy. I suspect he would be less likely to put so much weight on personal relationships and more weight on sort of what he views as the benefits of international engagement. I know that's a pretty vague answer, but it's
Okay. We have a next question is, good afternoon, Dr. Lowry. It's an honor to have you here. On political system lessons, our conclusions about this kind of crisis, like a pandemic, when the country sadly lose many lives and resources, they make the leaders stronger, especially the populist ones. But it's not so clear to me at this time of the US. In your opinion, what kind of pandemic gives Trump the power he needs to win?
Well, yeah. So the pandemic is the other, obviously the big issue here. And you're right. Potentially, that gives a populist leader a great deal of authority and power. But Trump basically has not wanted it. I mean, he early on, he said, "I take no responsibility," and it's kind of up to the governors to deal with this. Although at the same time, anytime a governor doesn't act the way he thinks they should, he attacks them. There's this news that just came out within the last 24 hours, basically, that he intentionally downplayed the pandemic, and he admits it. He said it wasn't going to be that bad when he had information to the contrary, which he apparently believed. But
Okay, you can finish, Dr. Lowry.
okay, yeah. So that is, it remains to be seen how bad that admission hurts him. His claim is that he didn't want to, cause panic, but other people are arguing that it would have been better to at least, level with people and then try to keep them calm. And given the way he did it, a lot of people sort of listened to him and took his advice, and a lot more people died than needed to. And so he hasn't really taken the pandemic as an opportunity to sort of assert his authority. If anything, he's been kind of staying away from it. And I think he honestly just hoped, he personally hoped that it wouldn't last very long and would just go away. So maybe he was engaging in some wishful thinking as well. But, at this point, I don't really see the pandemic as making him stronger at all.
Okay. Our next question from Stella. So good afternoon, Professor Lowry. What damage do you think the epidemic can do to the United States and the rest of the world for the U.S. to be the world power? Thank you for your time. I can complete this question and say, do you think the pandemic can threat the U.S. leadership concerned about not just economic, but the most powerful country, especially not just the world, but especially in the North America?
Yes, especially if we continue on this path where the United States doesn't seem to be controlling the pandemic as well as most other countries. Although the main channel is the economy. It's almost impossible to say what the long-lasting consequences of this are going to be for the economy. All kinds of businesses that have gone bankrupt aren't going to come back. It's going to cause major, changes in the structure of the economy. Things that people did during the pandemic, some of them they're going to decide they like or keep doing things that way. And again, some of the old things are never coming back. And simply because it seems like the pandemic is going to last probably longer in the United States than most other powerful countries, yeah, it probably is going to hurt the U.S. Canada, I know, has done much better in terms of controlling the virus in their country. I'm not sure about Mexico. You mentioned North America. But also, it's not just the reality, but also just sort of the perception, of the United States as this very prosperous, very competent democracy. And, we kind of look to it and say, is that really the model, that we want to follow if you guys can't seem to get a hold of this any better than you have? So yeah, I think it really could be a problem. Moises, I can't hear you again. Hello?
Oh, okay. So
There you are.
Oh, okay. I was saying that now we have more than an hour of our meeting, and I have to say that, especially for me personally, it was a great time to hear. You can hear you again. I think our students had a wonderful time, and so you have just one more question. The last one. Most of the students have classes now, but I'm going to have one last question. So do you think the lack of better way of threatening the epidemic on the U.S. can make changes on the decision of Trump's election?
Do I think the lack of a better way to affect the election?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of people blame him for the pandemic being as bad as it is. I don't know if his base does. His base is about 40% of the voters, apparently. The real question is again, sort of and there aren't that many undecideds at this point, but among maybe the 10% of voters who could still go either way, I would think that the pandemic and the fact that the U.S. hasn't responded to it better, and might well push some of the others in favor of Biden. So in a close election, it can make a difference.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. I'm gonna speak in Portuguese just a little bit, Dr. Lowry, just to say goodbye to everybody. Ok? And
Sure.
I come back to you. Pessoal, eu acho que foi muito boa a nossa reunião. Acho que o Dr. Lowry contribuiu bastante, né, para as nossas questões. Eu queria agradecer a todos, né, que fizeram questões, que compareceram. Em nome do NERI, né, de professor Felipe, de toda a equipe do NERI, que deu o suporte, né, para esse evento acontecer. Eu gostaria também de agradecer muito. No próximo dia 23, nós teremos uma outra live também com Dr. Cavallo, né, que também PhD em Política Pública e Política Econômica nos Estados Unidos, e vai falar sobre acordos bilaterais, certo? O pessoal do NERI vai mandar o link também, disponibilizar para vocês.
Can't hear you again.
Dr. Lowry, I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your ideas about this theme. Here in Brazil, I mean, especially in the international relation major and economics major, our students are kind of eager to see what's going on in October. So thank you so much. It's a great time to have you here. For our entire academic community, you are very honored to have you here. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks. No, I enjoyed it. It's really interesting to me to hear how people outside of the United States, what they're concerned about, and how they view things. So I enjoyed it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, my picture was frozen, but what can I say?
No problem. No problem. Thank you so much.
All right.
All right. Muito
See you
obrigado. See you. I'm gonna send you a message here.
Okay.